Good morning, PT on Ice team. Welcome to a PT on Ice Daily Show. Sorry for the delay, 6 minutes behind schedule. Having some internet difficulties, but that's why you got LTE. You know, you just fire up when you can't get on the Wi-Fi. But here we are, Fitness Athlete Friday, PT on Ice Daily Show. Coming to you live from CrossFit Two River West, my home base facility. I'm glad you guys could be joining us. I see some of you trickling in right now, so thanks so much for being on. You know, just a really exciting week. A lot of courses going on this last week. Was down in Columbia, South Carolina last week with a great crew of clinicians. Brandon Vaughn of Vertex PT, Josh Jeffries, Carolina CrossFit and CPT Strength. Just a great crew down there, and had an awesome time. And one of the topics we're going to talk about today was one of the topics that we spoke on and had a really good discussion on at our course this weekend in Carolina, which is looking at heart rate variability. Now, if you're a member of Virtual Ice, or VICE as Jeff so much doesn't like it to be called, if you're a member of Virtual Ice, you will have seen that our COO Alan went live or put up a supplemental lecture for us on heart rate variability and some really in-depth science on that. And so take a look if you're a member of the Virtual Ice community. That is worthwhile 30 minutes that you should sit down over lunch and have a listen on on heart rate variability. It'll make a lot more sense with this topic today. But we have been discussing these concepts around Tim Gabbett's research, the acute to chronic workload ratio, and looking at that as its predictive ability to say, hey, you know, these athletes are about to get injured, and we need to kind of change some things in our athlete training load dosage, right? And so the refresher for you, if you don't remember that acute to chronic workload ratio, that's looking at, you know, what has our training looked like in the past 4 weeks compared to what does our training look like in the last week itself. So the last 4 weeks of training would be considered our chronic workload, right? Or, you know, synonymous with our fitness. It's our buffer, right? It's what we're trained and adapted for over the course of the last 4 weeks. Low battery, awesome, just all sorts of hurdles today. That's what we're prepared for over the last 4 weeks. Now, the fatigue is that acute workload. That's what happened in the last week. And so when we compare what we've done in the last week with what we've done in the last 4 weeks, that's a ratio between acute to chronic, and we want that to be somewhere between 0.8 and 1.3. What that means is essentially like a more jazzed up version of the 10% rule, like slowly dosing in more training over time so that we have positive adaptation, but we don't have any acute spikes in training load that may suscept us to injury that we're not prepared for. Okay, that's great. But if you're anything like me, you understand that accounting for all of that data is a challenge, right? Especially with our CrossFit athletes community. It would be easy if we were just tracking one variable, right? If we were just tracking mileage, or if we were just tracking time, that's simple. And so what we do with CrossFit athletes then is try to use this RPE-based measurement, right? We can say, okay, you had a 30-minute training session at an RPE of around 6 out of 10, right? You were moving at like a 6 out of 10 for 30 minutes. That will give us a data point, and we multiply out time by RPE. That will give us a data point that we can use as our tracking variable in that acute to chronic workload ratio. Cool. That still requires you to track a whole bunch of data, though. And if you're like me, getting your hands on that kind of data or doing Excel spreadsheets and trying to track with all those athletes and all those figures can be cumbersome, right? But we need some way to see, is the athlete overtrained? Is the athlete adapting well to my training stimulus, to the work I'm asking them to do? And without you know, the gold standard of that, which would be performance measurement, right? By asking that athlete, if you are well recovered, then your performance should yield greater results. I can't bring an athlete in the gym every day and ask them to 1 rep max deadlift to see how they're feeling. Right? That's not a measurable, you know, way to sustain training over time. By every time that athlete comes in the door, you're hammering them to test their performance. You can't do that. So what other variables can I gather to see if that athlete is well adapted, well recovered, and ready for another hard training session? Or if I need to back off on the training load that I'm asking them to do, right? One piece of that, one window into the body, into recovery, is this heart rate variability as it continues to emerge, and it's not new information. And you will not be surprised to hear that mad scientists like Mike Eisenhart has been tracking heart rate variability since, you know, when I was in high school or something, right? So it's no surprise and it's no new secret, but it continues to emerge as one of the indicators and one glimpse into the system and how we're recovering, right? And so what heart rate variability is in a nutshell, and I'm going to go very briefly over this. Again, this is where, the science like Alan is portraying it will give you a lot more in-depth analysis. But if you think of an EKG strip, if you just close your eyes and envision an EKG strip in those QRS complexes, which indicate the ventricular contraction, right? That big spike on the EKG, right? The top of that spike is your R interval. What heart rate variability looks at is R to R interval times, right? So from beat to beat and how much time between those beats. Now, what you would think is that that's a pretty standard mark, that time sequence is pretty standardized. If you have a 60 beats per minute, 1 beat per second, but it doesn't work like that. There is a lot of inherent variability between beats. Some are quicker than 1 second, some are a little longer than 1 second. That's an indicator. That variance in time between R to R is an indicator of your autonomic nervous system, the nervous system that's required, that's in charge of fight or flight and rest and digest, parasympathetic stuff. That's a glimpse into how well recovered you are. And so a well-recovered body, one that's in parasympathetic state, that's adapting to the training load, that's not under tissue duress or inflammation, will have a lot of variance between R to R beats, right? It will have a lot of gaps, some slower, some longer. A nervous system that's still trying to recover, that's still trying to adapt, that's still trying to clear out inflammation, and I'm stressed, and my sleep is off schedule, and home life is out of whack, the variance there will start to tighten, meaning that beat-to-beat intervals will start to look a lot more mechanical in nature, right? They will start to look a lot more sequential. And by having that information is a surefire way of asking or looking at that athlete and saying, you have not adapted, you are not recovered to what we've asked you to do, you're not responding to the training load well, and we need to back off on our training load. This will correspond really well to some other figures. And what Williams in 2017 has done has taken a group of CrossFit athletes, group like people that I'm working with today, right? It took a group of competitive CrossFit athletes and it said, okay, we understand this acute to chronic workload ratio. We understand heart rate variability. Let's see if these two line up together in terms of what these CrossFit athletes are doing, their training, right? And so it tracked a small group of CrossFit athletes, and it looked at their acute to chronic training load, just as I mentioned, using session RPE times the time that they were training, right? Tracking that variable, and they also tracked heart rate variability. And what they saw was athletes who stepped out of that acute to chronic workload ratio, where they got above 1.3, where they started doing a little too much too soon than what they were adapted for, also correlated with a decrease in heart rate variability. Remember, the tightening up of those R to R intervals. That was also correlated with an increased risk of subsequential injury. It was predicted of when they would become injured. This is super, super powerful information. But what's even more powerful is that there are apps and there are ways to track this information. So not only do you need to be the mad scientist with your Excel spreadsheet and trying to track all these data figures, we have apps on our side that can help us make sense of all of this data together and just stand back at a global aspect and look and see who's at a greater risk. One of the apps that I'm playing around with right now is called HRV4 Training. HRV, the number 4 training. It's like $10 on the App Store or something like that. It's the one that I'm using right now, and what's really nice about it is that you just put your finger up to your camera, right, and your camera flash will light up, and it will take a 60-second heart rate variability tracking, right? It'll track your heart rate for 60 seconds and come up with your variability within that 60-second window. Not only will it do that, it will ask you a ton of subjective figures associated with it. It will ask you how you're feeling, how well recovered you are, how sore you are this morning, were you traveling, are you stressed, what's your mental energy like, how long did you train yesterday, what was the RPE based on that session. It's gathering those data points for you inside of looking at your variability, right? And so the goal here is to wake up every morning and to take your variability, standardize the same time, so you wake up, you go to the bathroom, you do your morning routine, and then you hit your heart rate variability right away. And so every morning it's starting to gather a data point for you. And over the course of 4, 5, 6 days, it can start to add these up and say, okay, here's your trend, here's how you're responding. Now I'm going to keep a pulse on when things step out of line and kind of be my indicator for when that happens. Combining the variability data, combining it with your total quantity of training hours, your RPE versus your intensity and your time, also with the other lifestyle factors. How'd you sleep? How'd you recover? Were you traveling? Did you have any alcohol last night? Are you sick? These things matter when you're about to come train and train hard, because if you roll in my gym, I either need to ask you the laundry of those questions, take your heart rate variability, and look at your data as you've been training and stand back and make an assessment on whether or not we're going to go hard today or not, or I just pull that data up in the app, right? And that's what's nice about this HRV for Training app, is that if I'm a coach, I can get access to a lot of my athletes' information, right? And I think it's $5 per athlete, and Alan made a comment that over 100 athletes, it's only $1 per athlete. And so if you're managing a facility like mine with 150 athletes inside these walls, you know, for $1 per athlete, they can all be using this HRV for Training in the morning, and all that data can be synthesized and sent over to me. It points out certain individuals. Hey, athlete number 4, they are in the red. They have not adapted to the training load this week. They have mentioned that they're stressed, that that they've been traveling a lot, and so that individual I can pull aside and be like, hey, what's your readiness to train right now? I was like, I'm not really feeling it, but I'm going to go there anyways. And that's an athlete that you can pull aside and say, hey, my information tells me that you're on the cusp of injury. And when we can start to predict who's about to be injured like that, we're a much more powerful player in the sphere of training and rehabilitation, because now we keep them off my training table and instead back in the game. And what I have them do instead is like, hey, here's a 20-minute slow recovery piece. I don't want your RPE to go over like a 4 on this. I want it to stay really light, but I want you to move from bike to rower to ski erg and just kind of get your heart rate moving a little bit. They can be in class while class is going on. They feel like they got a workout in, but the overall intensity was super low. It was more of an active recovery than it was anything else. And now we've kept that individual from pushing, psychologically making themselves go there when their body wasn't ready physiologically, and we pulled them back just for a couple days and then allowed them to train harder, and will yield greater results long term with that. So again, one more time, that app was HRV for Training. I'm still playing around with it. I'm having a couple of my athletes kind of sample it for me and see kind of what's the data, because it's synthesizing the acute to chronic for us, it's synthesizing the heart rate variability, and it's also throwing on top all those subjective measures on the back end that, as a coach and as a rehab provider, if you're managing the care of a lot of individuals, this is something that's super helpful. Because again, I don't want to be the one making out that Excel spreadsheet. My name is not Mike Eisenhart for good reason in a lot of different ways, but I don't want to have to input and track all that data. I want it synthesized and sent over to me, and then I use my clinical judgment on who's ready to go and who's not ready to go, and then we can make that assessment in the gym. So heart rate variability, check out that Williams 2017 study. We'll link it in the comments right below here if you're watching live. That was with that group of CrossFit athletes, and it looked at the acute to chronic workload with heart rate variability and who was about to get injured with injury prediction. And also check out that app. You can go on their website and read a bunch of their information and their data, HRV for Training. I think it's super cool. It's one of many, though, guys, of course. It's one of many apps that are out there. I encourage you to play around with them. And if you have some other good apps that you think are useful, tag them in the comments and start a good discussion about this, because I think all of us are collectively trying to wrap our head around how can we best utilize this information in the clinic? How can I best put evidence into practice? And what Gabbett tells us is that, hey, man, monitoring acute to chronic training load, keeping it between a 0.8 and 1.3 over time is best practice for avoiding injury. So this is one way for us to synthesize that information, take a peek inside the athlete with heart rate variability, and make best in practice training protocols. So that's what I wanted to chat with you guys about, HRV, the apps that we use, acute to chronic workload, and why that matters to your training. Hope you guys took some value on it. Leave some comments. Happy to engage in some discussion with you. And if you haven't checked out Virtual Ice, again, be on the lookout for the next cohort that opens up over there on Virtual Ice. So awesome. You guys have a fantastic weekend. It's Friday. For us, it's the 4th weekend of the Open. So we got some crew down here, and I'm sure you can see them, getting all stretched out down there, getting ready to go. We got 18.4. We got some deadlifts and handstand push-ups. So we're super pumped. A lot of people on the road. As always, check out the ICE website, see when a course is coming near you, and check us out. The biggest one, the one I'm most excited about, is that second weekend in April 7th and 8th, when we're out in Vegas with the whole crew. We got the sampler platter out there in Vegas. that's going to be a blast out there at RJ's clinic, and you know, Mike and Christina and myself and Mike, and I already mentioned Mike and Jeff and Justin Dunaway and Morgan Denny. It's just going to be a phenomenal crew. So if you haven't booked your ticket already for the ice sampler platter in Vegas, you might want to consider it. I'm just saying. All right, that's enough rambling for now. Sorry about the delay this morning, but we got it fired off in time. We'll see you guys next week. Adios.